Today's topics are nominations and elections. So we'll first go through nominations, and then we have a nomination script that we'll read through, and then we'll talk about elections. And we did get one question in advance, which we'll be able to address probably during the script. So the first question is, why nominate? It appears that once upon a time, that they would just use straight motions for nominating people. So someone would say, I move to nominate, so-and-so, and then it would be seconded, and then it would be voted either up or down. And then if they weren't elected, then someone else would nominate someone else. And so what they've done is they've evolved a process for nominating people, and it has many flavors. And you'll find that in this material, this is also an area where Robert's Rules of Order gives lots of suggestions as opposed to mandates. There are some things that you need to do to adhere to fundamental parliamentary procedure, but there's a lot of areas where they recommend that you take this topic and you further define it in your bylaws for procedures that you should have that fit more into your organization and how you want to run your business. So there's, as I was saying, there's a number of ways that people could be nominated to a position. You can do nominations by the chair. You can do nominations from the floor. You can do nominations by a committee. And then there's some that are lesser used, like nominations by ballot and by mail, and then by petition. And we'll go over the details of each one of those. So a mass meeting, there's a definition for a mass meeting, and those are meetings where you don't have a fixed membership. And so perhaps you have some important issue in your community that you need to pull everyone together with, and you just put out a call for a meeting and then people randomly show up. And so at a mass meeting, it is a common practice to have the chairman nominated by the person who is designated to call the meeting to order. But in an organized society, they should adopt other methods of nominating for office. And I just worked with a group in Rockland County, New York, that did this process. They weren't organized, but they were having this issue where the chair wouldn't call a meeting so they could have an election. And so we worked through a process that adhered to basic parliamentary procedures where they could proceed with the meeting with nominations and get their business done. More typically, you either get nominations from the floor or from a committee. And so under the procedures of nominations from the floor, the chair calls for the nominations at the time established by a rule or custom of the organization or assembly, which may be while the election is pending or earlier. So, what that means is that you could have nominations like at the prior meeting, and then those nominations would be up for election. So when you get nominations from the floor, a member need not be recognized by the chair to make a nomination. And with nominations, no second is required. And where there is more than one person to be elected to an office, no one may nominate more than one person for the office or position if an objection is made until every member wishing to nominate has had an opportunity to do so. So that, if you're the presiding officer, you got to make sure that people that are overly enthusiastic about nominating people for office don't hog all the space, and that you alternate between the various members so that everyone gets an opportunity to nominate someone before someone can nominate a second person. But then there's this caveat: in no event may a member nominate more persons than there are places to fill. So there's two circumstances, and we'll see both of these in the script that we're going to go through today. There's elections where you elect one person, like the presiding officer or the president or whoever leads your organization. And then there's the other circumstance where, like, you're electing delegates to go to a convention and you have like 10 positions to fill. And so what this is saying is that in any event, a member any one member may nominate they may not nominate more than number of places to fill. So if you've got 10 places, someone can't nominate 15 people. If there's no nominating committee and the nominations are from the floor, the chair calls for them by saying, nominations are now in order for the office of president, or whatever the position is. And if there is a nominating committee, the chair calls for a report of the nominating. The recording secretary should take down the names of each of the people that are nominated. Nominations for different offices are called for in the order in which the offices are listed in the bylaws. So if your bylaws have like president and then vice president and then secretary and then treasurer, that would be the order in which you call for the nominations for those positions. Nominating committee should be elected by the organization whenever possible, or else by its executive board. And what this does is it makes it a level playing field, and so you don't get undue influence from people to skew the nominations process itself. Although it is not common for the nominating committee to nominate more than one candidate for any office, the committee the problem is finding people to fill the positions, and you've performed a miracle if you've got a candidate for all of the offices. However, if you're in a situation where more than one person is interested in running, then they should be allowed to do so. And it's important to remember that members of the nominating committee are not barred from becoming nominees for the offices themselves. So just because you volunteered to be on the nominating committee doesn't prevent you from running for an office. It's always important that after the nominating committee has presented its report and before the voting for the different offices take place, the chair must call for further nominations from the floor. There's a little bit of awkwardness, because if you have nominations by a committee and you know them in advance and you're using a ballot, then those names can show up on the printed ballot, but that's not possible when you do nominations from the floor, and it's going to be followed by elections. So your ballots need to provide for a blank spot so people can write that in. And it's always great to have some method of presenting the names, like projecting with a screen or something, so that everyone has the potential candidates in front of them. After the nominations have been taken, the chair should again ask if there are any further nominations. And if there is no response, the chair normally declares that nominations are closed without waiting for a motion to that effect. After nominations have been closed, a majority vote is required to open them. And this is an important step to do. So you have a clean distinction about when people are being nominated and when they're not. And so people don't shout out names after it's been closed, and then it becomes ambiguous about who actually is nominated. So what this does is gives a clear definition of when nominations have closed. The recording secretary has recorded the names. If someone wants to add a name, then they move to reopen nominations, and makes it very clear when names can be taken. And then after nominations have been closed, voting for that office takes place, or nominations are called for by the chair. And the next office is called for by the chair, depending on the procedure being followed by a particular organization. So there's two ways to approach elections. You can do all of your nominations followed by your elections, or you can do it alternately, where you take a nomination like for the president, and then you do the election for the president, and then you take nominations for the vice president, and then you do the elections for the vice president until you've filled all the positions. Another way to nominate people is by ballot. Acting it with an ordinary elections ballot, except that everyone receiving a vote is nominated. So if you have 5 people in your organization, then everyone receives a nominating ballot, and it just takes one person to nominate a name. You don't use a process by saying, the person who received the most nominations, or the top 2 people who received the most nominations get to go on the ballot. Anyone who receives one nomination gets on the ballot. But then they also say that they do not have the right then to make nominations from the floor unless the assembly by a majority vote authorizes such nominations. So if you go to by ballot, then everyone is nominated by ballot, and then that's your process for nominations. unless the body decides to do something else. If you have a organization where people live a long ways away, you can also have a nominating ballot. And then again, anyone who receives a nomination by the ballot is nominated, and with the secretary of the organization mailing them out and then giving them instructions for completing it and returning it. And when you have a situation like this, it's important to have the rules governing the process, like how much time people get to vote and when it has to be returned by to be a valid nominating ballot. So you have that clear definition of when things are due and can be processed. A process you sometimes see in public offices is nomination by petition. So when I lived in Astoria, if you were running for city council, you had to have a petition signed by 5 residents saying that, yes, these 5 people want to have you run for city council. And then there was a higher threshold for the mayor. I think you had to get like 25 signatures to run for mayor. And then you go around and you fill in the petitions and you turn them in, and the elections clerk will verify that the signatures are all valid, and then that places you on the ballot. But again, if you have a process like this, it has to be articulated in the bylaws. The last time I gave this class, there was a lot of questions about nominating speeches. And so this is what the current version of Robert's Rule says. So to give a nominating or a seconding speech, a member must first be recognized by the chair while the floor is open for nominations. The member may then nominate a candidate, and without waiting for the chair to state the nomination, speak in favor of the candidate, or they may speak in favor of a candidate because we have free speech in this country, and you can do that kind of thing if you want to. Again, nominating speeches is a great area where it's nice to have a set of rules about how it's done, so that it's all done equitably and everyone knows the rules, and you have a level playing field before the process begins. So this section is on elections. And what we'll talk about are the types of elections, the teller's report, the way that the results are announced, and then what to do if the results are contested. So ballot elections are a very common way to do this. And as I was saying, there's 2 alternate procedures for the sequence of nominating and voting. So you could do all nominations and have them completed before the balloting takes place, or you could do the balloting for each office immediately following the nominations from the floor. And hopefully this is a rule that is specified either in your bylaws, or these could also be in your standing rules because they're procedures. In a democratically run organization, if there's no alternate provision for a voting methodology, then a majority vote is required. Regardless of the methods of election, any office remains unfilled after the first ballot. If any office remains unfilled after the first ballot, the balloting is repeated for that office as many times as necessary to obtain a majority for a single candidate. Sometimes you see elections by plurality, which Ruth Bader was just a horrible way to do it, and it's not recommended, because what you end up with is situations where you split the vote and you end up with some unintended consequences. And so the fundamental rule is that it's a majority vote is required to be elected. When a majority is not achieved, the balloting is repeated for an office. Individuals are never removed from the candidacy on the next ballot unless they voluntarily withdraw, which they are not obliged to do so. I am a member of some organizations that have rules about dropping the lowest vote getter, and that's a way of ensuring that the vote you'll come to completion. If you have an instance where you have like 5 first ballot, then you go to the next one. If you have a process for dropping off someone, then you know that you're never going to do more than like 4 ballots. But you need a rule to do that. Otherwise, you're taking the rights away against the candidate. So you have to have a rule about dropping candidates if that's what your organization wants to do. I often see people trying to do things after the ballots have been distributed, but it's not cool to do that. So when a vote is being taken, no interruption is permitted from the time that any member has actually voted until after all have presumably voted, unless, as sometimes occurs in ballot voting, other business is being transacted during voting. So you might have an instance where the ballots are distributed in the morning and then people can fill out the ballots.
Larry, we lost you.
Nominees receives a majority vote.
Larry, I'm
Yes?
sorry, we lost you. Could you repeat what you said after fill out the ballots?
Under interruption of votes. So when a vote is being taken until everyone is presumably voted, unless sometimes you have in the rules you've allowed for the ballots to be distributed and then some business to occur, and people have like a couple of hours in which to fill out the ballots and then turn them in. But to do that sort of thing, you need a rule governing the process. Another way to do elections is by voice vote. And this is similar to fill in the blanks, if you remember from last week. So you've got a number of names and presumably you've got one position to fill. As soon as one of the nominees receives a majority vote, then it declares them elected and no votes are taken on the remaining nominees for that office. So if you have 3 people nominated and the first person gets a majority vote on the first ballot, then they are elected, and then you don't proceed on because your body's decided by majority vote that person will be elected. When a number of members are to be elected to identical offices in the nature of a single office held by more than one person, the same procedure is followed. So if you have, if you're electing like 2 delegates to go to a convention, then you would, and you have like 5 names that have been nominated, you would vote on the names until the 2 positions have been filled, and then once 2 candidates have received a majority, you would stop because those people have been elected. Roll call elections, are really are sometimes called for, and then of course it have to be specified in the bylaws. When it's called upon, they declare you get so roll call elections can be either each person who's a member of the assembly being called for their vote, or you could have aggregate totals recorded. So when I go to a state meeting, in my state we have 36 counties, and so the chairman of each county delegation would collect their votes, and then they would be recorded by a roll call vote by the chair, so that everyone hears the number of votes cast, and then they're totaled, and then the winner is declared. There's a process called cumulative voting, where a member is entitled to cast 1 vote for each position, so that, for example, 3 directors are to be elected. Each member may cast 3 votes, and these votes may all be cast for 1, 2, or 3 candidates. as the voter chooses. So this is a derivative process, and it would have to be allowed for in the bylaws, but sometimes you get this. So they can
Larry,
cast.
we lost the sound again for about a minute.
Great.
If
Can
you
you, is
could-
it, can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. If you could just repeat maybe the last two sentences.
Cumulative voting is where each member is entitled to cast one vote for each position, so that, for example, 3 directors are to be elected, each member may cast 3 votes. This has to be allowed for in the bylaws, but someone could cast all 3 of their votes for one candidate, or they could split their votes so that one candidate receives 2 votes and another one receives 1 vote. And this allows them to, it's kind of a version of weighted voting. And maybe this is something that your organization might want to do, but again, it has to be allowed for in the bylaws. And then there's ballot voting, which is a very common way in which to do that. This is always a more complicated for the ballots, and they've had to postpone the elections because they got into the meeting and they found out that they were in way over their head. So again, if you're going to do balloting, it's really important to have a meeting in advance so that you've worked out all the details. But the chair appoints the tellers to distribute, collect, and count votes. And then when ballot is completed, the chair directs the tellers to collect the ballots. And the tellers are responsible for ensuring that no one votes twice. So it's really good to have a process around this so that you understand that one vote is given to each person, and someone does not receive 2 ballots. Or you could do it on the back end where you check off the ballots as they're turned in so that you know that everyone's turned in a ballot. You don't just necessarily know how they voted. After the votes are cast, the polls can be closed. And again, this is an important process, so you know that when you have stopped voting, so you don't have stray ballots that are going to pollute the total. But you as chair should make sure that there's been adequate time given for everyone, and that you've called for the ballots, like 3 times, and make sure that everyone understands that their ballots are due. After the votes are cast, the polls are closed, and it's important to have clarity over when you have stopped collecting ballots. But the chair should go out of their way to make sure that everyone understands that their ballots are due, and give people, announce it several times that the ballots are due and you're going to close the polls, and then that marks the distinction where you've stopped accepting ballots. The teller's report is really important because it's a very clear way of reporting the results of the election. And in Robert's, if Robert's Rules of Order is your parliamentary authority, then this is the format in which the results are prescribed to be reported in. So the first piece of information is the number of votes cast. So you could have 100 people in the room, but only 90 people decided to cast the votes. The next piece of information you record is the number necessary for election. So this would be half the numbers cast plus 1, probably. So if you've got 90 people who cast votes, then the threshold for election would be 46. And then you would list the number of votes each of the candidates received. And then you would also record the illegal votes. And so usually illegal votes are where people have marked for 2 candidates when they only have 1 vote to be cast. And so then those would be reported so that people have a complete accounting of the votes cast in the election. When it's time, after the tellers have finished the report, the chairman of the tellers then comes up to the podium and standing addresses the chair and reads the teller's report and hands it to the chair without declaring the results. So what the teller reports is the data of the election, but not the results of the election, because it's the chair's responsibility to announce the results. The teller's report should not include the number of members eligible to vote. So again, if there's 100 people in the room, It doesn't matter. What's really important is how many voted. And so you don't report also the number who abstained, because that's not part of the calculation. The reporting teller never declares the result of a ballot vote, because that's the responsibility of the chair. And the results are always declared by the chair, who also reads the teller's reports before they do so. And it feels a little bit redundant, but it's really, the chair who's the presiding officer making it official, the results of the election. And in an election, the chair separately declares the election of each officer. It is best if an election is completed at the session at which it is taken up, unless it's impossible or impractical to do so. I was in one meeting where the windstorm came up, and it was like tornado circumstances, and so the meeting was adjourned prematurely. If you have an assembly that wishes to adjourn when an election is incomplete, then it's best that an adjourned meeting be provided for. And I think we talked about this at the last meeting, where someone says, I move that we reconvene on Saturday at 10 o'clock, so that you have a set time to complete the continuation of the election. If such an adjourned meeting is not provided for, and the organization will hold another regular business session before a quarterly time interval has elapsed, then the election is taken up automatically at the next regular meeting. And if you remember our discussion on agendas, then that would be a special order. The most important effect of this, though, is that unless you have a provision for the person being elected taking office immediately, or at the end of the current meeting, then they immediately become the presiding officer in the case of a president, and the former occupant of that office sits down and the current one takes over. Sometimes they're not prepared for this, and so it's really nice to have a transition in your bylaws that says that the election takes effect at the end of the meeting in which they are elected, so they're not caught like deer in the headlights. Sometimes you have results of an election contested. So depending on the circumstances, the voting body may be able to order a recount if an election was conducted by ballot, roll call vote, or counted vote, or in the case of a roll call vote, a recapitulation may be possible. It also may be possible under some circumstances to order that the election be voted on again by another method. Otherwise, an election may be contested only by raising a point of order. And we talked about a point of order last time. That's if you feel like there's been some irregularity or something improper that's done that has polluted the voting. The general rule is that such a point of order must be timely. Other exceptions to the general timeliness requirement are those that come within the 5 categories listed on page 251, in which cases a point of order can be made at any time during the continuance in office of the individual declared elected. So if there's something egregious that happened and it fits in one of these 5 categories, and it's a little too complicated to go in through here, but if it's one of those 5 categories, then it's it's classified as a continuing breach of the rules, and so you could raise a point of order saying, the election was invalid and it needs to be redone, and then that would be handled like you would handle a point of order from the floor. This one is important in that I was also in a circumstance where people felt that they had influence or something that they did not. But because the voting body itself is the ultimate judge of the election disputes, only that body has the authority to resolve them in the absence of a bylaw or special rule of order that specifically grants another body that authority. And specifically, the circumstances we had was that we had a committee that elected its officers, and it was contested, and the presiding officer of the overall organization thought that they could step in and order it to be redone. But it's the it's the body that conduct that own the election that is the only one that can do that, unless there is that power given to someone in the bylaws.